So finally then we're going to look at the whole training week, and this is where we're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts of how we put sessions in the right places at the right time to ensure that, again, we've got key weeks where we're going to be really looking to push on, and for example those deload weeks to facilitate recovery and adaptation. So to begin with, what we're going to look at is just the kind of initial problems that might be faced when we're looking at the training week, which is simply we're not really sure what goes where. When we're looking at a training program, there may be many kind of factors we have to consider. We've already mentioned some of the factors outside of training we've got to consider, such as things like nutrition, sleep, academic stress. So on top of things like having lots of hockey on in the week, knowing what to add in and when in order to meet the needs of the hockey player in terms of getting everything covered off physically is obviously of high importance. So the key consideration then is three things. The rule of two, which I'm going to be going into, that's the frequency of which we need a certain type of training every week. High and low days, so which days are days to push and which days are days to ease off. And this sits in line with the training month. So we've got weeks to push and weeks to pull, and then within the week we've got days to push and days to pull, and that helps us to effectively plan out what goes where, how much intensity is going to be required, and so on. So the rule of two, high and low days and recovery days. If we look at the rule of two, the rule of two is just a name I've come up with, but in effect this is the frequency with which we need to be training all of these different physical qualities. So we need 2 mobility sessions a week, we need 2 strength exposures, we need 2 exposures to tissue capacity work, we need 2 speed exposures, so sprinting, and we need 2 conditioning exposures as well. Now, the first thing to say is we don't need to make this 10 sessions a week, because when you look at it on face value, that sounds like a huge amount. The key is to be smart with how we program these things, how we combine things together, how we put different types of training together so that it just kind of morphs into one. So as a quick example, mobility before a strength training session makes complete sense. Speed exposures before a conditioning session or a pit session makes complete sense. So I'm just going to give you examples here of how you can go about doing this. So a couple of ways as examples which we can combine there for all these different elements. Mobility can go at the start of training sessions. So for example, 15 minutes of the strength session at the start is going to be allocated to lots of quality mobility work. Tissue capacity work, so working on the calf, adductor, hamstring, trunk, for example, at the end of strength sessions. In the strength training section, we showed already that half the time allocated should be going towards strength, half towards tissue capacity. So very simply, 4 sessions has now become 2 strength exposures per week, within which we're going to be doing tissue capacity work. Speed exposures during on-pitch warm-ups. So if you're doing 2 school or club matches, so ways that we can combine these. Firstly, we can combine mobility at the start of strength sessions. So for example, the first 15 minutes of a strength session makes complete sense to focus on that mobility. We can combine tissue capacity work at the end of strength sessions. So you've already seen in the strength training section that we can put these things together. So half the amount of time allocated towards the squat, hinge, push, pull patterns, and half the time towards tissue capacity work of the calf, hamstring, adductor, and trunk. Speed exposures during on-pitch warm-up. So if you're doing 2 training sessions and 1 match per week, then as part of the warm-ups for 10 minutes for those 2 training sessions, we can get 3 to 4 really high quality speed exposures every week. We know the reason for this is we know that during hockey matches and training, players rarely hit above 90%, 90-95% of their true maximum, and true speed training is at those high thresholds. So we need a couple of high quality efforts to kind of stimulate that. And then conditioning can be done before or after pitch sessions. So very simply, as a top-up, you can do a 15-minute conditioning session at the end, or you can turn up early and do 20 minutes before your pitch session. So we're not having to add in more, we're just extending out what's already in place. So an example with a rule of 2, this is how we could put all of this together into 1 week. On a Monday, we're going to do 10 minutes of mobility, half an hour of strength training, and 20 minutes of tissue capacity work in a session. So that's a 60-minute session in total, and 3 boxes have been ticked. On Tuesday, we've got hockey training for an hour, hour and a half. In the movement prep, we're going to do 4 linear sprints with a good amount of rest between them. So, sort of 2 minutes recovery between sprints. And in between, we can do your mobility work. Conditioning top up at the end of the session for 20 minutes. And again, we've now ticked off, 2 of those. On a Wednesday, we're going to do, again, 40 minutes of strength training and 20 minutes of tissue capacity work. So that's another hour. Thursday, we've got a hockey training plus a conditioning top up of 20 minutes. On Friday, we're just going to do a 20-minute mobility just before the match on a Saturday. Nice and simple. And then on Saturday, just before the match, we're going to be doing 4 sprints during the movement prep to get yourself prepared. And those sprints can be things like rolling 20-meter sprints. So very simply, you can see there how you haven't really had to add in a great deal in order to get everything covered off. It's not enormously time-consuming. And there are also other ways which we can use existing training to tick off things without having to require you to do additional work as well. High and low days. So the key principle here is that you're trying to make the high days high and the low days low. So training needs to be hard enough to stimulate adaptation, so really providing overload on that day, or easy enough to promote recovery, but not really something in the middle, which often just leads to kind of needless fatigue. So examples of what we would call a high day would be like a hard hockey training session over an 8 out of 10 RPE, which is the rating of perceived exertion difficulty. High intensity sprinting, maximal strength training, plyometrics, and intensive conditioning. All of those would be examples of hard training that's going to really start to stimulate adaptation. On low days, we can do easy hockey training, so let's say like a 6 out of 10 and below. Aerobic conditioning, so long extensive conditioning efforts, or steady state conditioning. Tissue capacity work and mobility work. So that would work quite nicely in terms of days to push and days to ease off. So the first thing to do with this is to say, well, what are already hard days and what are already easy days already in place? And then to kind of double down on that. So not to add in more, but to simply complement what's already in place. In terms of recovery days, there's a lot of research done on this with respect to how many days is required of athletes. There's none specifically done in hockey, but there's a lot done in different areas of training and different sports. So in one piece of research, athletes were unable to repeat a 10 repetition maximum test load-wise with only 24 hours of rest. So 24 hours later, they were unable to do so. 48, 72 hours later, they were able to. Athletes with less than 2 days sort of per week of recovery during the training season had a 5-fold risk of injury, and that was done in endurance athletes. So, those two seem to be pretty key there. And more research has shown that overtraining is thought to affect 60% of elite athletes, which is clearly an enormous amount. So as a rule of thumb, 2 rest days per week is an appropriate rule of thumb for competitive athletes. Now, sometimes this is unrealistic given how much training people may have on. And so what's important is that this is seen as a kind of a target, a rule of thumb, but not a non-negotiable. A non-negotiable is 1 day. There must be a day per week, which is a rest day, but ideally 2. And if we're planning our training out effectively enough, we should be able to achieve this relatively realistically. When those days are, it just depends on the context, but ensuring you're writing in 2 rest days per week is going to be important to facilitate that recovery between hard training sessions. So now what I've done is just given you a couple examples here of how you can piece all of this together. So on the top line, we've got hockey, middle line strength training, bottom line conditioning work. So if this is in season and we need to have 2 training sessions a week and a match, 2 strength training sessions, 2 conditioning sessions every week, you can use a RP of the hockey training session as a rule of thumb to determine whether more conditioning is needed. Because ideally you want to get your conditioning from hockey, not having to add in more on top. So on the Tuesday session, it's only a 6 out of 10 RPE, so it's quite an easy session. So we're going to add in 20 minutes of conditioning work at the end. So we've ticked off one conditioning exposure in that week. The second session, however, was an 8 out of 10 RPE. It was quite intensive, a lot of match play, a lot of kind of 2-on-2 kind of work, really intensive. So there's actually no need to add an additional conditioning if it was, say, a more than 60-minute session above a 7 out of 10 RPE. That's already given you a pretty high stimulus if it's in season. So you've already got the hockey being taking care of the conditioning as well. Then on the other days, we've then got our strength training, and we've got 2 recovery days inbuilt. If it is in season with a match on a Sunday, similar principles, but in this example, both hockey training sessions are below or a 7 or below RPE. So we've got 2 conditioning sessions, 2 strength sessions on alternate days. We've got a Monday and a Saturday recovery days. So we've got 2 recoveries taken care of, 2 strength training, 2 conditioning. We're going to have 2 speed exposures during the warm-ups here, and 2 mobility exposures and tissue capacity during the strength training session. So all things have been covered off. So 2 mobility, 2 strength, 2 speed, 2 capacity, 2 conditioning, 2 recovery days have all been ticked off in that example. Pre-season then, there's no match. So what we're going to ideally look to try and achieve during pre-season is actually 3 conditioning exposures. So in this example, you've got the hockey training on these 2 days. So what we're going to look to do is, irrespective of how hard they were, because we need more volume because there's no match, we're going to do conditioning at the end of the hockey session or before it anyway. Again, strength training on different days because you want the competing demands if we're trying to do strength and conditioning on the same days. And then we've got a Wednesday and a Sunday recovery days, and we've picked up another conditioning session here on the Saturday. So again, all the boxes ticked off. And then finally, during an off-season, this is just where we don't need to do lots and lots. We just need to do a little bit of generalized training. And in this example, there's no hockey at all. So as the bare minimum, we've got the 2 strength sessions, 2 conditioning sessions. You could potentially pick up even more or do other sports on those different days. But ideally something like a Wednesday and Sunday days off. In this example, because it is a period of recovery, we've actually got a 3rd day off. But again, that just gives you an example of how you could piece that together during the off-season. So hope that's given you a good sort of insight into ways in which you can program out during the week. So as an overview, we need to have 2 of all of those different elements tied into the training week, and trying to work back from when the most important days are, what are the priority sessions, and then from that we can start to work in those recovery days. 1 non-negotiable recovery day, 2 ideally, and then 2 exposures to all those different elements. And there are lots of creative ways we can put all of that together. So it doesn't need to be 10 sessions on top of our hockey sessions. It can actually be as little as sort of 3 or 4 throughout the training week.